The grand kingdom of Della was abuzz with excitement and preparation. King Aldrin and his beautiful queen Aralyn had decided to embark on a journey like no other. Their destination? The humble town of Oakvale, where the family of the renowned Lady Della resided. Lady Della was a true gem, her kind heart and selfless nature earning her the admiration of all who knew her. She had dedicated her life to serving the people, establishing orphanages, schools, and hospitals throughout the realm. It was only fitting that the king wished to personally honor Della's family for raising such an exceptional woman. As the royal processions made their way through the winding roads, Lady Della was busy putting the final touches on a surprise of her own. You see, her dearest friend was none other than Prince Obi, the dashing heir to a neighboring kingdom. Della had been dreaming of this day for months, to finally introduce her beloved parents to the prince she held so dear. However, Della knew her parents could be difficult at times. Her father, Lord Eldrin, was a gruff, no-nonsense man who showed little affection, especially towards his daughter, and her mother, Lady Elara, was consumed by propriety and appearances. Della worried they would not receive Obi warmly. That's why she urgently sought out her loyal childhood friend Ivan. Meeting him in a secluded glade, Della made Ivan swear an oath of secrecy. "You cannot breathe a word of Prince Obi's imminent arrival to my parents," she insisted. "This surprise must be perfect." Ivan, ever the faithful companion, swore on his honor to keep Della's secret safe. With a conspiratorial wink he promised, "Your surprise is safe with me, my lady." The very next morning, Ivan found himself facing the intense scrutiny of Lord Eldrin's piercing glare. The master of Oakvale Manor had summoned Ivan to inquire about his daughter's whereabouts. "Where is that foolish girl?" Eldrin spat, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in contempt. "Do not lie to me, boy. I know you were with her yesterday." Elara, wringing her hands nervously, chimed in. "Please, Ivan, tell us where our Della is. We simply worry for her safety is all." Thinking quickly, Ivan responded with a calm facade. "My lord, my lady, you need not trouble yourselves. Lady Della is doing quite well. I merely ran into her while seeking employment opportunities in the marketplace yesterday." We exchanged pleasantries briefly before parting ways. The lie rolled off his tongue smoothly, much to Ivan's relief. Lord Eldrin seemed placated, if unconvinced. "Bah, that insolent girl will be the death of me yet, always wandering about without a care, unbecoming of a lady of her stature." Elara fretted. "Now, Eldrin, do not be too harsh. You know how our Della struggles to be content within these walls. She has such a tender, free spirit." Eldrin scoffed loudly. "A free spirit is just another way to say utterly lacking in discipline and decorum. Mark my words, that girl's stubbornness will be her undoing one day." As the Lord's rant continued, Ivan couldn't resist defending his oldest friend. "If I may, my lord, I cannot help but admire Lady Della's kind soul and compassion for the people. Why, she brightens the lives of all who cross her path. You should be proud to call her your daughter." An uncomfortable silence fell over the manor's grand hall before Eldrin finally spoke in hushed tones. "Be that as it may, I simply wish she did not insist on shaming our family name with her headstrong antics." With a defeated sigh, he dismissed Ivan to attend to his duties. As the young man departed, Elara placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "He is right, you know. We should count ourselves blessed to have raised such a kind-hearted special daughter as Della." Eldrin's scowl softened momentarily before he shrugged off his wife's touch. "We shall see if she remains so special when she inevitably embarrasses us in front of the king." At long last, the fateful day of the king's arrival descended upon the humble town of Oakvale. Della was practically giddy with excitement, having spent the past few nights meticulously planning every last detail of the momentous event. Her breath caught in her throat as the booming call of the herald signaled that the royal procession was approaching. A hush fell over the crowds that had gathered along the palatial grounds of Oakvale Manor. Dozens of liveried footmen and knights burst through the gilded front gates first. Their ceremonial pikes were raised high. They formed an honor guard as a blindingly ornate golden carriage trundled into the courtyard. Lady Della's heart fluttered as the regal figures of King Aldrin and Queen Aralyn emerged, waving graciously to the cheering citizens. The royal couple certainly cut an imposing figure, draped in sumptuous velvets and priceless jewels befitting their lofty station. yet their warm smiles and twinkling eyes radiated benevolence, putting the people at ease. As the manor's master and lady stepped forward, heads bowed in reverence, a look of discomfort flickered across Della's features. Her father's back was ramrod straight, lips pursed tightly in his usual dour manner. Meanwhile, her mother Elara curtsied deeply, not daring to make eye contact with her sovereigns. "Lord Eldrin, Lady Elara," King Aldrin's rich baritone rang out, "we are most honored and humbled to grace your ancestral home on this joyous occasion. We have called upon you to express our deepest gratitude for the extraordinary gift you have given the realm." Elara's eyes widened in surprise, stealing a quizzical glance at her daughter, standing off to the side of the gathering. Della's serene smile and slight nod prompted the flummoxed woman to remain silent. King Aldrin continued, "By raising and nurturing such an exceptional, pure-hearted soul as your daughter Della, you have helped foster the very ideals and virtues our kingdom prides itself upon. We owe you a debt of gratitude that can scarcely be repaid." It was then that Della stepped forward, radiant and poised. "Your Majesties, you honor my family with your generous praise. However, it is I who am truly indebted to you both." With an impish grin she proclaimed, "For you have not only shaped me into the woman I am today through your wise leadership, but also bestowed upon me the greatest gift one could hope for." On cue, the courtyard fell silent once more as another figure emerged from the crowd, the unmistakable strapping form of Prince Obi himself. Lord Eldrin's eyes narrowed dangerously as his daughter gently took Obi's hand in her own. "My dearest friend, my other half," Della announced boldly. "I give to you Prince Obi, my heart's truest companion. It is my greatest honor to finally introduce him to my beloved family at long last." A kaleidoscope of emotions cascaded across Eldrin's reddening face: shock, anger, humiliation. Before he could unleash his famously volcanic temper, another voice pierced the tension. "How dare you!" All eyes turned towards the disturbance as a figure shoved his way through the throngs. Della's breath hitched in her throat as her gaze fell upon the wild-eyed, disheveled form of her former beloved. "Bob! What are you doing here?" she cried out. Silence hung thick in the air as the bloodied, raving figure of Bob lurched closer, a look of crazed anguish contorting his features. His tattered clothes and unkempt appearance stood in stark contrast to the pristine, elegant surroundings. Della's chest tightened with dread as the horrible realization set in. The child she had been carrying, the life they created together during stolen, passionate embraces, it was nowhere to be seen. Her trembling hands instinctively cradled her belly as she choked out a strangled plea. "Bob, where is our baby? What have you done?" The deranged man let out a guttural cry of pure anguish. "Our baby? Ours? After what you've done," Bob's eyes were wild with pain and betrayal as he lashed out at Della. "After what you've done, you have no right to call that innocent child yours. You defiled our sacred vows, our love." He gestured accusingly at the shocked Prince Obi, spittle flying from his snarling lips. "With him have you no shame, woman? I gave you everything, my heart, my fortune, my entire world, and you threw it all away for this crown-wearing whelp." Della recoiled as if struck, tears streaming down her cheeks as the court watched the disturbing outburst in horrified silence. Mustering her courage, she stepped forward imploringly. "Bob, please, you must listen to reason. What we had was real, I'll never deny that. But things change. People outgrow each other over time. I never meant to bring you pain, I swear it." The crazed man was having none of her placations. "Liar! You carried my child, my flesh and blood. That was a bond that could never be broken until—" His wild rantings descended into unintelligible shrieks and wails. It was then that Elara rushed forward, fear and desperation etching her delicate features. "Enough of this lunacy! Robert, tell us, where is the baby? What have you done with my grandchild?" Bob's haunted eyes bored into the Queen Mother's, revealing a tempest of anguish and instability. When the words finally left his quivering lips, they sent shockwaves through all in attendance. "The child! I killed it. Our baby is no more thanks to its deceitful, faithless mother." A horrified cry tore from Della's throat as she collapsed to the ground, body racked with uncontrollable sobs. Eldrin stood in stunned disbelief, too petrified to even bellow out his inevitable thunderous rage towards the man who had murdered his grandchild. King Aldrin's brow furrowed in righteous fury as he signaled his knights to seize the unhinged Bob. But before they could apprehend the pitiful wretch, another voice lanced through the bedlam, dripping with black hatred. "Robert, my poor, sweet, tormented Robert." Della's mother Elara had stepped forward, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Yet her voice remained steady and cold as iron as she addressed the deranged killer. "My daughter has made her choices, foolish though they may be, and you have taken justice into your own misguided hands in the most unforgivable way possible." She placed a gentle hand on Bob's wan face, smiling with sinister tenderness. "But all is not lost, my child. You can still atone. You can still give us back our grandchild, our flesh and blood heir." A hush fell over the grounds once more as all watched Elara spin her dark web, inexorably reeling in the fragile Bob. "You will lay with my Della," she purred, shooting a disdainful look at her shattered daughter, "and you will plant a new seed within her womb to replace the one you murdered. In doing so, you will finally absolve yourself of these sins that torment you so." Eldrin watched in stupefied revulsion as Bob seemed to regain a spark of clarity in his glassy eyes. Like a man grasping at his last lifeline, he gave an imperceptible nod of acquiescence to Elara's depraved proposal. Yes, I will do as you command, my lady. I will right this wrong and restore what I have taken from you." His voice was a ghostly rasp as he allowed Elara to possessively grasp his trembling hand. As the disgraced Bob was led away to carry out his grim penitence, Della seemed to finally find her voice. Between racking sobs, she cried out to her father, "Father, do something! Stop this madness at once! That man, he cannot be allowed to defile me again after what he's done." It was then that Lord Eldrin turned his gaze upon his daughter at long last. Della's breath caught in her throat at the look of pure disgust and loathing that contorted his features into an inhuman rictus. "Be silent, foolish girl!" His bellow echoed across the grounds with thunderous finality. "This is the bed you've made for yourself. You disobeyed me at every turn, dishonored our family, and spread your legs like a common whore for this traveling grift." Della felt as if the world was crumbling beneath her feet as her father's vicious diatribe bored into her like 1,000 white-hot lances. Eldrin was utterly unrestrained now, his carefully cultivated veneer of noble dignity shattered beyond repair. "You think you can prance about, batting your eyes and trading coy smiles to ensnare whatever poor fool crosses your path?" he spat with undisguised revulsion. "First it was that snivelling worm of a merchant's son. May he rot in the lowest pits for his crimes. Now you've set your treacherous sights even higher, aiming to sully our family lineage forever by whoring yourself to royalty." Obi made a move to interject, to defend his beloved's honor, but King Aldrin stayed him with a solemn hand. As much as the young prince's heart ached to shield Della from this torrent of paternal vitriol, they both knew this was a reckoning that had been simmering for years. Elara watched on in stunned silence, her own role in this spiraling tragedy temporarily forgotten. Della searched her mother's eyes for any shred of warmth or compassion, but found only hollowness staring back. "Look at you," Eldrin hissed, gesturing up and down his daughter's slumped, wrecked form with dripping contempt. "Cowering like a beaten dog at the first consequences of your selfish, reckless actions. You are no daughter of mine, a lady of pure Delanian blood. You are a willful blight upon our ancient honorable lineage." With an anguished howl, Della rose unsteadily to her feet to face her father's towering, shaking form. How can you say such cruelties to me, father? To your own flesh and blood?" she cried, choking back racking sobs. "I have loved you since the day I took my first breath. Was it so wrong of me to want to follow my heart's truth for once in my God's cursed life?" It was a plea that fell upon deaf ears. Eldrin sneered, basking in the ability to unsheath decades of pent-up resentment and disappointment in his air. "Do not speak to me of love and truth after what you've allowed that monster to do. That man slaughtered your own innocent child, the one good thing you might have accomplished by pure unintentional nature. Now its blood weighs upon you as much as it does him. What worth could you possibly have left after inflicting such dishonor?" The obsidian doubts and self-loathing that Della had fought to keep at bay came crashing down in overpowering waves. She saw herself through her father's eyes, a ruined, spoiled thing that had perverted the sanctity of life and the promise she once held. As Della sank back to her knees, the struggle to remain lucid amid the relentless torrent of recriminations becoming too arduous, Eldrin turned his withering judgment upon his wife. You enabled this, Ilara, filling her head with romantic fancies, coddling her wanton desires instead of tempering them with discipline as I urged you to do. Now look upon the wasteland of a family you've helped cultivate, a depraved murderess for a daughter, and a grandchild's blood on your hands. The words finally snapped Ilara from her daze of shock and denial. She shot her husband a look of pure, unbridled hatred through the streaks of tears now pouring down her face. I won't hear any more of your snarling bite, you wretched old boar, she shrieked, trembling with unrestrained emotion. You pushed and you sneered as our beautiful girl bloomed into a woman before our very eyes. But that's all she is to you, isn't she? Not a precious life we created together, but a cold commodity to be traded off for status and breeding fertile heirs. You sickening, heartless tyrant! The searing familial rift seemed to ripple outwards through the entire gathered crowd. Nobles and common folk alike exchanged uneasy glances, the lines between propriety and public spectacle hopelessly blurred by the carnal hostilities on display. King Aldrin caught Della's haunted gaze for a fleeting moment, wearing an inscrutable expression tinged with pity. With a subtle nod, the monarch signaled his guardsmen to clear a path as he began ushering Prince Obi away from the melee. Della reached out a trembling hand in wordless entreaty, desperate for Obi's reassuring touch, his solid presence to ground her amid this maelstrom of hatred and shattered familial bonds. But her fingers closed around empty air as the prince was swept away by the tide of armored guards under King Aldrin's orders. Obi's anguished expression as he was pulled from the courtyard was the last ember of hope snuffed out in Della's heart. She was adrift, battered by the furious cross-currents of her parents' seething recriminations, with no anchor to cling to. Lord Eldrin seemed to revel in his daughter's desolation, squaring his broad shoulders as he prepared to deal the final lancing blow. Look upon the ruin you've wrought with your selfishness, girl. A grandchild's life snuffed out before it had chance to bless this world. An ancient noble name befouled by your wanton lusts and rebellious defiance. His steely eyes narrowed to slits as he jabbed an accusing finger towards the shuddering broken form of Bob being detained nearby. That twisted creature was to be the vessel that carried on my family's proud legacy, and you spurned him for this. A harsh bark of mirthless laughter escaped Eldrin's cracked lips. No more. I will not sully my lips further by calling you daughter. From this day, until time itself stops turning, you are nothingness to me. A pall of shame and bitter regret to weigh me down until I draw my last agonized breath. Della could only let out a keening, inhuman wail of anguish in response. Her entire world, her dreams and hopes and identity, had been systematically flayed and discarded before her by the man whose approval she'd endlessly craved, no matter how cruel or callous. By the time she finally regained some sense of lucidity, the crowd had dispersed and the courtyard lay empty and still as a tomb, the only sounds her own ragged sobs echoing back. Della's childhood companion Ivan tried in vain to comfort her, but she violently shrugged off his efforts, his one lapse in judgment unleashing this entire calamity. Hour became day, day became week, as Della remained entombed in her family's estate under the watchful vigil of the increasingly unstable Ilara. The malevolent matriarch kept switching between bitter rages where she heaped her own scathing diatribes upon her daughter, and times of eerie calm where she tended to Della's needs with a somber, hollow tenderness. Do not fret, my love, Ilara would murmur, gently stroking Della's lank hair as she fed her thin broth. We shall have our heir soon enough. Robert is being prepared to plant his seed anew and restart this cursed cycle. With his issue reborn in your womb, we can finally wash away this stain upon our family. Della heard these words as if from the bottom of a deep well, disconnected and muffled. Part of her, the part that still clung to life out of sheer muscle memory, recoiled in horror. But the rest had simply accepted the inevitability of her violated existence continuing perpetually. When at last the fateful time came for Bob to be submitted to Della's chamber and made to rape her very soul, the haunted young woman didn't even possess the strength to struggle. Ilara had pumped her with herbs and draughts to numb her senses and make her pliant, little more than an receptacle for Bob to spill his unholy seed within. As that final degradation commenced and Della retreated to the deepest recesses of her blasted psyche, Only one morbid flicker of awareness surfaced through the numb haze. The vile machinations of her twisted parents had succeeded. A new hellspawn was now gestating in her tainted womb, an innocent life created solely to appease the venomous whims of her progenitors. With that horrific epiphany finally cutting through her spirit, Della at last found the dark blessing of eternal oblivion reaching up to merciful claim her. The light of her brilliant, passionate soul was forever extinguished, smothered by the cruel avarice and poisoned legacies of those who should have cherished her most. The days and nights soon blurred into an endless, suffocating delirium for Della. Time held no more meaning, no markers to latch onto as her existence was reduced to a hollow, unfeeling purgatory. She was vaguely aware of the new life gestating in her defiled womb, but the thought inspired only a haunting detachment. Her mother, Elara, seemed to drift in and out of her sight like a vengeful spectre. Sometimes the malicious matriarch would materialize silently at Della's bedside, gently tending to her physical needs with chilling banalities about preparing for the birth of the heir. Other times, she raged and ranted like a madwoman, berating Della as the harbinger of all her anguish and shattered dreams. It was on one of these latter occasions when Bob unexpectedly lurched into view, eyes still glassy and shell-shocked from the horrors he'd enacted. Elara whirled on the pathetic fool, showering him with hateful epithets. "Look what you've done, you depraved monster! Putting your spawn in her after your vile butchery. Can you not simply disappear and grant us peace from your wretched shadow?" Before Bob could respond or even try to articulate his fractured psyche, Elara descended into a fresh torrent of hysterical invectives. "If that useless lump doesn't birth a viable heir, I'll see to it you're denied entry through the very gates of the afterlife itself. I'll hire every two-bit cultist and hedge wizard to torment your cursed soul for eternity." Della watched the frantic tirade with dull, impassive eyes, feeling utterly unmoored from the turmoil swirling around her. She'd retreated so deeply within the labyrinth of her own mind that even these bombastic, dramatic proclamations barely registered as more than a dull buzzing. It was only when Elara finally stormed off in a huff, shoving Bob aside hard enough for him to stumble against the bedframe, that a flicker of awareness managed to penetrate the fog. As the pathetic man recoiled from the impact, their eyes met for the briefest of instances. In that fleeting shared glance, Della saw the depths of Bob's tormented, guilt-ridden soul laid bare. It was a glimpse into the shattered remnants of the earnest, caring young man she had once loved deeply, the person who had been twisted and perverted into an empty cipher by the sins weighing upon him. In that infinitesimal moment of mutual anguish, a dim spark seemed to reignite in Della's hollowed spirit. Perhaps it was the simple empathy of recognizing a kindred broken soul adrift in the same ocean of agony as herself. Or maybe it was a visceral reflex, her very life force crying out for even the most elusive connection to cling to when all seemed lost. Whatever the impetus, Della fought through the merciful numbness that had encapsulated her for so long and managed to feebly reach out a slender hand towards Bob's arm as he staggered away. The trembling, cracked syllables that finally spilled from Della's parched lips were more wretched and profound than any prayer or bellow of anguish. "Help! Me!" Bob froze as if struck by divine lightning itself, her cracked whisper of entreaty reverberating through him like a thunderclap. He turned with agonizing slowness, scarcely allowing himself to meet Della's haunted gaze, those once vibrant, sparkling eyes now dimmed to a hollow facsimile. "Della," he croaked, voice shredded by the lashing guilt and recriminations he'd endured. You speak to me? After everything I've—" He trailed off, unable to give lingering voice to the monstrous acts he'd committed, his mind recoiling from the all-consuming darkness as it so often did now. Bob's fingers twitched spasmodically, as if feeling the phantom caress of the life he had so brutally snuffed out. Della simply stared at him with those barren, endlessly deep eyes that seemed to hold the entire weight of the cosmos itself. Somehow in that fractured moment, her silence conveyed more yearning and supplication than 1,000 cries or pleas. It was a gaze that reached past the veil of atrocities between them and appealed to whatever fragile slivers of shared humanity still endured. At long last, Bob seemed to understand the truth, permeating from her vacant stare. With a shuddering, indrawn breath, he sank to his knees at Della's bedside, clasping her delicate hand as if it were the most sacred of religious relics. "You need not beg me for succor, nor attempt to stir what's left of my blackened conscience," he rasped, voice grating like crumbling stone. "In truth, I am the one in eternal debt to you." Della remained impassive, but the fraying threads of her attention were bound utterly to Bob's every faltering syllable. "I have torn asunder the very fabric of creation itself in my mindless quest for vengeance," he confessed, the words lacerated from the deepest pits of his fractured psyche. "I have despoiled the sanctity of new life, betrayed vows sworn before the eyes of the gods themselves, and reduced an existence of infinite beauty and hope to this." Fresh tears sprang to Bob's reddened eyes as he clutched Della's listless hand feverishly to his brow in a gesture of abject penance. "All I can offer you now is a promise, both futile and eternal. I will spend every waking moment of whatever new detestations await me in the afterlife, atoning for these unforgivable sins against you." For a breathless heartbeat, Della's stricken features finally flickered with the faintest spark of lucidity, as if Bob's raw anguish had momentarily pierced through the suffocating shroud of her own mind. But just as quickly, that infinitesimal spark winked out, and her eyes resumed their glassy, thousand-yard stare towards the void. Della's silence seemed to only compound Bob's torment, as if her inability to acknowledge or accept his entreaties was a condemnation far crueler than any vitriolic rebuke could aspire to. With a despondent moan, he pressed his quivering lips to her limp knuckles in a final, devastated act of futile devotion before staggering woodenly away. As the disgraced man's footfalls faded down the drafty manor corridors, Della knew with a morose, detached certainty that she had just witnessed the last lingering embers of Bob's spirit, his fragile sanity and sense of self, be utterly extinguished by the all-consuming force of his wretchedness. He would soon fade into a vacant, shambling husk, neither living nor dead, but enduring in a waking purgatory more bleak and inescapable than any finite torture the afterlife could conceive of. And deep within Della's own fractured soul, a faint twinge of remorse managed to penetrate the all-consuming numbness that encapsulated her harrowed existence. The once brilliant light that had illuminated Bob's path, drawn him inexorably into her very orbit with its warmth and vivacity, had been forever extinguished, both within him and her own defiled vessel. As that final harrowing truth nestled alongside the infinite agonies already lancing her spirit, Della gradually retreated back into the stagnant void that had become her only remaining sanctuary and respite. There were no more tears to be shed, no further pleas or yearnings to vocalize. Her unborn heir's restless stirrings within went utterly unacknowledged. An eternity of lightless, empty nothingness had already descended over Della, her once blazing essence reduced to a cold, extinguished cinder. The anguished sobs and wails from the birthing chamber that fateful night were not those of Della. She remained an insensate, hollowed wraith as the violent throes racked her frail form, her very existence now nothing but a vacant vessel to deliver the next ill-begotten generation into their nightmarish legacy. No, the tormented cries of agony belonged solely to the bitter, broken woman presiding over this blasphemous ritual, Ilara. For as Della finally expelled the squalling, red-faced infant from her battered womb, the twisted matriarch was finally forced to confront the full, ruinous weight of her machinations. This was not the long-awaited heir to the noble Delanian bloodline, a proud continuance of centuries of tradition and providence. It was a wretched, pitiful harbinger of abject shame and defilement, conceived in an act of unspeakable depravity and violation. Cradling the mewling newborn against her chest, Ilara seemed to rapidly age before the terrified midwife's very eyes. The lines of bitter anguish carved into her features went from harsh and severe to utterly abyssal, leaving her face a sunken, haunted death mask of a once breathtaking beauty. At long last, she understood the true soul-binding finality of the path she'd so arrogantly set into motion. This detestable, squirming byproduct of ruinous betrayal, violence, and toxic obsession with lineage would be their family's ultimate legacy, a lingering mockery sired in denigration and forged in the scorching crucible of unforgivable sin. As this harrowing truth subsumed Ilara's remaining sanity, her tortured wails reached a terrifying animalistic crescendo that sent the entire manor's staff scurrying in fear and dread. Only Della remained unmoved and unblinking, as if already disassociated from the earthly throes of birth and death. For 17 endless, arduous days and nights, Ilara's shrieks and howling never ceased. She grew increasingly incoherent and hostile, alternating between bouts of raving and literal physical convulsions as her mind shattered into infinite obsidian shards. On the final evening, the abused, traumatized infant let out one hoarse final cry towards its wretched, inconsolable mother figure, only to be met with deafening silence. Ilara's ravaged throat had at last fallen utterly mute, preventing her from inflicting any more audible suffering upon those in her cursed presence. When the guards finally dared approach the antechamber where she'd barricaded herself, they found Ilara languishing before the dying embers of the hearth in an utterly catatonic state. Limp and unresponsive as deadwood, not even her eyes twitched as they extracted her from the rancid detritus that had accumulated around her lurched form over the past weeks. And so Ilara was delivered to the family's austere manor in that vegetative purgatory, forced to endure watching over the bestial offspring that signaled her ruination, until death's blessed reprieve finally claimed her years later. Some claimed to occasionally glimpse a flicker of awareness, of haunted recognition, lingering behind those deadened eyes when faced with the presence of Della's cursed spawn. As for Della herself, she would never acknowledge that hideous, squalling creature that gestated in her defiled vessel as anything remotely akin to her own flesh and blood. On the rare instances when she became vaguely cognizant of its mewling, insistent presence, it would prompt only a detached vacancy in her dulled gaze, as if her very soul had preemptively excised itself from any possible remaining connection to this world or the harbingers of her eternal ruination. And so the cycle of violence, obsession, and despair that had birthed this unholy, malformed heir wore forever on, the haunting echoes of its dread conception destined to reverberate across generations immemorial. A once luminous family tree bearing the bountiful fruits of promise and continuance found its final withered branches overrun by the virulent, strangling vines of madness and moral necrosis. As eternal darkness eventually claimed the last embers of tortured awareness in Della's forsaken emerald eyes, only the faintest wretched susurration seemed to linger behind in the emptiness that remained. Better we had never been.